All right. 501. Everyone's here. Leanna, welcome.
Hi, Rory.
Yeah, if you guys are okay, if I start now. Awesome. Okay, I don't know why I keep getting kicked out of this meeting, but if I do get kicked out, I will rejoin. I did just want to start off by saying that we are recording and I am doing the live transcription as well so that people can follow along and read if there's something that I've said that wasn't quite clear or you would like to review afterwards. So to begin, this is, welcome. This is my presentation for the PIDP 3300, the Cognitive Science of Teaching and Learning course. My name is Rory O'Brien, and my presentation is going to be on neurodiversity in adult education. So my background and where I'm working at right now, I work at BCIT as an instructor at the aerospace campus. I'm an aircraft maintenance engineer by trade. I work in YVR, and right now I'm teaching the Aircraft Maintenance Engineer M program, which is a 2-year diploma prior to entry into the workforce for becoming an apprentice, and then eventually for those students becoming licensed. So part one of my presentation is going to focus on neurodiversity in adult education, but what actually defines neurodiversity, some of the science behind neurodiversity, some of the indicators instructors might want to look out for in their classrooms, and then what barriers these students are actually experiencing when they're identified as neurodivergent. I just wanted to clarify everyone can see the slides okay and sees me clicking through them. Okay, awesome. So neurodiversity defined. Neurodiversity is basically just an individual variety of experience and interaction for a student. So how does one student differ from another in terms of their intake of material, or how does one student or person's interaction vary between how they actually interact with people? Neurodiversity or neurodivergent people can be neurodivergent based on neurological or based on developmental differences among themselves. One thing that I'm promoting and that this presentation is trying to acknowledge the work of people who are doing this is that in education, we should be looking at these differences that are at people who are neurodivergent as having differences and not deficits. Okay, so again, what is a neurodivergent person? Who is a neurodivergent person? So it's somebody who may not communicate information or communicate their thoughts or feelings at the same pace or at the same rate as someone who is neurotypical. It's someone who also might not process information in a classroom in the same way as someone who is neurotypical. As many of us know, there are many people in the world who are neurodivergent and who are extremely accomplished, and these accomplishments should be celebrated. Okay, so the science of neurodiversity. So the applied developmental neurominorities are individuals who have learning disabilities such as dyslexia. People under this category of the applied developmental neurominorities are going to have conditions or experiences that affect them typically only in an educational setting. They won't be related to health issues, and they typically won't limit them outside of a school. They'll be able to function in their lives without many barriers, although there will be some. For individuals who have clinical developmental, who are clinical developmental neurominorities, they're going to be people who have something like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. And the implications of ASD or ADHD is going to have a much broader impact on that individual's life than the other like dyslexia that we spoke about before. Okay, so this picture here, it has the two basic categories that I went over. So on the right, we have the developmental or the clinical side, again with the ASD, ADHD, and then the developmental or applied side, things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. On the bottom here, however, we have another area of clinical, which is the acquired. So neurologic. This is somebody who has been neurotypical for most of their lives and then experienced some sort of accident that affected them physically and affected their brain in a way that actually caused them to become neurodivergent. Similar to the acquired clinical psychiatric category, this individual could have been neurotypical, but developed some sort of health issue or disorder, such as depression or schizophrenia, that has actually made them more identify with the traits of somebody who is neurodivergent or a neurominority. Okay, so this is just a quote from the MPDI encyclopedia, is that neurodiversity reflects human individualization. This is a precursor to my next slide and next picture, but I think this is really where we're going with neurodiversity in the classroom and in really instilling it into all of our educational institutions from the primary level all the way up to post-secondary. And the first way that is happening is through language. And I have in the red box here, normality to prevalence. So typically a chart like this wouldn't exist where it's grouping all these different brains together and just placing them based on their traits. We would say one group of these brains is normal, one group of these brains is not. Whereas on this chart here, we're actually just saying what traits are more prevalent in which brains, and then how do we classify those brains, where we have the trait expression on the left, and then the brains in the middle, which are neurotypical, and then the ones on the far right, which are the neurominorities. So for student indicators, as an instructor, it's the easiest way to identify if somebody is neurodivergent is if they self-disclose to you that they are. That is the most efficient way and easiest, but it's not always the most common. Sometimes it's going to take weeks or months to actually get that feedback that you need from assessing and working with these students. Another indicator or another classification of indicators is going to come from students who are on the autism spectrum disorder, and those are going to be classified into social interactions and then behaviors, which I'm going to go into right now. So the social interactions of a student who might have ASD, you might see somebody who's not actually able to make consistent eye contact in conversations, or it's eye contact that isn't typical of somebody who's in their position having that conversation with you. As well, in those conversations, those individuals might actually be struggling with the back and forth of a rhythm of that type of conversation. Their facial expressions might not be aligned with some of the things that they're saying, and similar to their tone of voice. It's not always going to follow the normal patterns that we're used to hearing in those type of face-to-face interactions. Okay, and the behaviors. So students might exhibit behaviors that are very, very repetitive when they might have ASD, and they're going to continue to do the same things over and over again and not really feel like there's anything that's abnormal about that, and which is totally fine, but it is indicative that they might have ASD. These students might also have a restricted interest. So they might be hyper-focused on one topic or one category of things, and they might be very interested, very invested, and knowledgeable about that topic. If these students are in a routine that's very consistent, but then it gets disturbed, it would be an indicator that they might have ASD if when this routine is disturbed, that it's a very big deal for them. They have difficulty coping with what's happening, and that will be exemplified in that moment by them, and it will be fairly noticeable to their peers. The last one, which is also something that you may notice, but it also may be something a student will bring up to you, is that sensory sensitivity. So a student asks you, can I leave the classroom? It's really overwhelming right now. The sounds in here are very, very loud, or the lights in the room are very loud. They need to go somewhere quiet just to settle down and to kind of reset. Okay, so this slide here is talking about the barriers that we're going to experience, or that students who are neurodivergent typically experience. So most of the time management skills, study skills, and organizational skills, which are three pillars of post-secondary education, are areas where students who are neurodivergent are going to struggle and are going to need extra assistance in. This is a very broad category, but this is what people have found. They also have difficulty with information processing. So whether that's reading, whether that's listening during a lecture, absorbing the information, or even in a one-on-one conversation, sometimes there's difficulty actually absorbing what the person is saying to them and what information they're supposed to be understanding. This chart here is basically a transition to part 2 of my presentation, where I'm going to be speaking about what changes we want to be seeing in education, and in particular post-secondary education. So the column on the left is speaking about the deficit-based special education system, whereas on the right, it's what we're working towards, which is a strengths-based special education system, which is grounded in neurodiversity. So the focus, again, with language, is instead of saying that it's a disability, we're talking about diversity. Assessment methods and instructional approaches, instead of testing to find these deficits or to determine the deficits, and then using instructional approaches such as just remediating that student's weaknesses, we're actually assessing to find the student's strengths and to find where they may be challenged, and then using what we've determined to be those strengths to actually help overcome the challenges and barriers that they're facing. We'll skip down to the program goals. So typically we build a program, we've developed a course, and we teach to the objectives of that, which is great, and that's fine. But with the strengths-based special education system, we're working towards focusing on the student and developing from where they are at until their full potential, at least in the time that they're there with us. Another important one is actually helping the students understand that they're there to maximize their strengths and to minimize their weaknesses, rather than just telling them that they have a disability and you need to learn how to live with that. The last area there is the self-awareness. So it's growing or building on what I've mentioned in the student goal section. And instead of explaining these disabilities to the student in a way that we were telling them that they're similar to a machine, or explaining it based on that type of metaphor, we're actually saying things like a brain forest, which is encouraging the students to think about their brains as an ecosystem, and that every individual student's brain is like an ecosystem, and they're all going to be different. And some things that are strong in one ecosystem are going to be weak in someone else's, but that the combination of elements within that is what makes each brain valuable and each student important. Okay, so part 2. This is where I'm going to get into basically the neurodiversity in adult education, but the part where we're actually moving towards changes that we're seeing right now, but also things that we hope to see in the future. The first part, we'll just focus on some barriers that instructors might face in actually moving things forward in a positive direction. The second part, I'll talk about some of the needs that students who are neurodivergent have in these areas. I'll introduce a learning process, which was new to me while reading about this topic. And then I'll summarize with just some ideas about the evolving classroom and, again, hopefully where we hope to see things move in the future. So just a few stats of graduation rate. So ASD students have a graduation rate of 39% versus neurotypical students who have a graduation rate of 59%. So given the same opportunities, there shouldn't be much difference between these two groups, but there is obviously a difference in the way instructors are prepared and are equipped to teach students who are neurodivergent. The first barrier that I've experienced and that I've seen other instructors experience is that the environment we teach in is not necessarily conducive or supportive of neurodivergent students. So the school system and our educational system was built around one idea, and it hasn't necessarily evolved to support the differences of students that we are having come into our programs. The training that instructors have been given is also very limited. It is something that is evolving and growing and improving, but it's something that I personally brought up as being an issue and kind of an area that needs a lot of attention for myself and my peers. And as I mentioned, as we looked at in that chart, comparing the two columns, the norms of special education are still instilled in our elementary and primary school systems. And that trickles into the post-secondary system where at times that it does feel like there are less supports for neurodivergent students. So the student needs. Many students will not really realize that they do need more research to be done on their individual, whether it's autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. There needs to be more actual research done that can help benefit the teachers and also benefit the students by just increasing the knowledge base on these disorders. As I was mentioning in the previous slide, with training and the norms of education is that the institutional framework of post-secondary institutions isn't where it really needs to be. And that needs to really change as a whole to start to accommodate and actually embrace these students and integrate them into the entire system of the way we build things. The last point here I've just mentioned, shift in thinking. So really just trying to educate all the instructors, but also all the students that you're in a classroom where you may feel that you're neurotypical or that your style of learning works with the way we're being taught, but that maybe the way you're being taught isn't actually working for a lot of the students in the class. So the neurodiversity paradigm, this is again is going to be a lead-in into the three-factor model, which I'll talk about next. But that neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. So again, just something to kind of capture what it means to have variabilities in a classroom, and that there isn't really a normal and not normal. It's just variables, and everyone's going to have differences in the way that they learn and the way that they present themselves. Okay, so how do we develop a learning process that can actually help us as instructors teach students who are neurodivergent without alienating students who are neurotypical? So the three-factor model, which is from Sewell and Park, goes off of these three steps, which is knowledge and training, strength-based assessment, and then teaching strategies. So with knowledge and training, let's say we had a student who at 7 years old was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. They're now in post-secondary education and there aren't supports for them there. It's the same way as there was through elementary and secondary school. So the instructors, first off, need to actually be educated on that specific condition, which means going to seminars, having recurrent training at their college or university with in-house workshops, and then also be given professional resources and contacts so that they can continue their learning and actually evolve with that student as their knowledge grows as well. The second step is asking that student to sit down with you and to actually have a conversation and ask them to self-assess what some of their strengths are so that we can move on and build teaching strategies and assessment strategies to kind of help them with what they've determined their strengths to be. So students may find strengths under the psychological category, so things that they've noticed either in school or beforehand in their personal lives that they have strengths with, and then things they've done in school before that they've excelled at. Some students with autism spectrum disorder will say that they've had higher rates of success with math. And from that, we can develop what their interests are, whether that interest is just math or whether there's things externally that they do like enjoy doing and that we could integrate into our assessments at the school. And one tool that I've used in the past as well with my students is talking about their past successes. So not necessarily at school or with their interests, but just getting them to remind themselves of what it actually felt like to be successful in something, and how did they come about that, and what was that process like. The last category is the teaching strategies. This is the most challenging for an instructor because unless you're working one-on-one with a student, you're going to have to run a hybrid model of your classroom or modify your course to accommodate. So creating that space where that accommodation can happen and that integration of your new assessment and your new teaching strategies can happen. This means aligning the skills that the student disclosed to you in the previous section with the strengths-based assessment, but also collaborating with that student. So not just developing a plan, executing it, and then not going back to communicate with that student. It's going to be an ongoing development for both of you in creating a classroom and a learning plan that works for everyone. Okay, so with the evolving classroom, just as a summary, changing language is going to be the first step in inclusivity with neurodivergent groups. Also, identification. It's not our jobs as instructors to take to diagnose students or to identify them. And knowing that some students may be neurodivergent and might not want to be identified as such is important, and also in maintaining that level of respect for that student. The application of the three-factor model is the application and approach there. So taking each new student that identifies as neurodivergent and applying that three-factor model to help them achieve their goals in the classroom. And lastly, like I mentioned, incorporating the ideas of those neurodivergent students as much as possible and involving them in their own learning process will really, I think, benefit everyone at the school. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you so much for watching and for being here. Are there any questions or comments or things you would like to address?
I'll go first. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, good. So have you used any of these strategies in your teaching currently? Is there an example you could give us of something you've done?
That's a good question. I think more so with the strengths-based assessment. I've had two neurodivergent students in the last 6 months, and in both cases, I have sat them down and asked them, what are the ways that you're used to being assessed, and where have you actually found success before? One student who wouldn't submit a test until their actual time had expired, which was actually quite a long extension for what they actually needed. And I would speak with them and say, well, how did the last test go? What were your experiences with this? Based on how much you study, would it be appropriate for you to submit, and do you feel like you would do well? And every single time the student would say, yeah, I've studied, I'm prepared, I'm ready to submit the exam. But there was that barrier that they were having with actually having the confidence to submit their exam, because they knew they still had that safety buffer of time afterwards that they could use, but they had finished the exam 45 minutes beforehand. So yeah, getting them to
Want to
recall.
submit it, but they didn't want to submit it until the time ticked away.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was purely a confidence issue. The student's extremely bright, but they must have had an experience before where they rushed through an exam, submitted it too quickly, and failed or something. So yeah, once I noticed this pattern, I approached them and said, okay, at this time, if you were done, submit it, and remember that your previous experiences with me and these exams we've taken, the work you put in, and this should be an experience that reflects those similar experiences from before. Yeah, also asking students to just write out the process that I've said to them, I think helps a lot, because sometimes they're hearing the information, but they're not processing it until they actually put it down on a piece of paper for themselves. And now they have their own checklist that they can go off of, which is just a written version of the verbal statement that I had given them.
Have you made any adjustments on assessments? Because you're a mechanic or doing mechanical things. I'm culinary, so people have to produce food. Have you made any adjustments to the physical activity of rebuilding something or maintaining something? For me, I have difficulty grasping how can I change the assessment of something that needs to be executed in a certain order with the correct parts or the correct ingredients. How do I change, I'll open to your thoughts. Like, how do I change something that is so specific, like maintenance or mechanical, to make that work?
Yeah, I found that a lot of the projects and maybe the instructions that we give are very, very vague, actually. And they to a new student, they're not descriptive enough. So I usually block off the sections of our projects for those students, and I actually write them out a much more detailed version of what it says there. So they're not doing a different project, but I make them come back to me at each step, because when they're given just the free reign of go start to finish on this project, it's overwhelming. and without clear instruction, they don't know what to do. But I can literally spend 30 seconds writing out a step for someone, and they go and do it faster or just as fast as everyone else in the class. So really breaking it down for them, I've found, is what really makes the difference. And just telling them that this is all you need to accomplish right now, rather than you're working on this whole big project and you have to worry about all of it.
That's good. I like it. I could use that for sure. Specific instruction, more detailed for those individuals. Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
Thank
because I find it's not actually like the skills that they have trouble with, it's the process, which can seem overwhelming. All right, Greg.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was a really good question now, because it led me to okay, now if you have someone who is neurodivergent, and or you think they are, and now you're trying to adjust your curriculum and your standards to meet the needs of the student, but maybe you don't know how to adjust the curriculum to meet the needs of the student. And so now hopefully they not self-diagnose, pardon me, they come to you and say, hey, this is what my I'm trying to use the appropriate language that you had in your PowerPoint. Uh, uh, Here's my individual, help me.
Yeah.
I can't.
Yeah, just I mean, this is my that a lot of the research I've found has actually said that it's completely up to the individual whether they want to say they have a disorder, or whether they want to say they're neurodivergent, or
yeah,
whether they want to acknowledge it at all. So
yeah, and then I'm thinking, okay, in any of our lines of work, I'm like, man, now I'm thinking, I want to talk to their therapist, or I want to talk to someone in the medical field that can guide, us as instructors on how to build a program or build curriculum in order to meet their needs. Because you could be really, going in the completely wrong direction, thinking that you're doing having a great idea here, but it's really not helping. So there'd be a lot of background investigative work to figure out what's going to work.
yeah, that research is huge. And yeah, it's unfortunately something that like none of us get really any training on. We get diversity inclusion training, but usually that's not the subject of expertise of the people who are delivering those types of courses and talks. And rightly so, like you do need to be a doctor basically to speak with any sort of validity with these types of things. So yeah, that's a huge area that needs to be taken or addressed, at least in post-secondary education.
Mm-hmm.
What have you guys found so far has been like your biggest challenge with that, or has it been something that you've come across much?
First of all, Rory, thank you for this presentation.
Thank you.
One thing that caught me that actually not each and every student actually knows about themselves and can acknowledge and is aware that probably they are neurodivergent. And if they don't know, how can we know about it? So like, it's about that we cannot make any assumptions. And yeah, and I think for teachers is a challenge if we suspect that someone is neurodivergent, but like this person doesn't say this and doesn't like require anything, like doesn't speak up. So I think this is a challenge for us as a teachers. How can we help in this situation?
Yeah, that's been a huge challenge for me too, because some students won't come forward, but do have like individual learning plans, which is usually a good indicator. But we aren't given any information about of why they have that. It's just they have this accommodation for tests or whatever. But there are many students who are definitely neurodivergent and who do need extra support. But without being formally diagnosed, there's no other intervention that's going to happen for them other than like test accommodations maybe. And Yeah, for us, it's like really challenging because they've never had someone intervene before and try to help them realize what the best way it is for them to learn. So yeah, that's why I think I mentioned that near the beginning, that sometimes it's like weeks or months for you working with someone before you can really develop a method of what's going to work for helping them learn. Yeah, that's the most frustrating part, is because usually by that time it's too late for a lot of students. And I find here there's a lot of like information sharing instructor to instructor, because for myself, like I teach the students right when they come to the college or in our program. So when a student does actually progress through, I can help the other instructors just giving them tips on the student. Because some students, the way they act is like it can seem rude, but that's just their mannerisms because of how they've developed. But yeah, you teach, just acknowledging that or sharing that information is huge, and it can help those students kind of have an easier time getting through the program. Yeah, is any other questions or comments?
No,
All
thank
right.
you, Rory.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
good
thank
job.
you everyone for
Yeah.
for tuning in. I appreciate it. All right. Have a good night.
Okay.
All right.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Rory. Cheers.
See you
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Take
See you
care.
guys. See you at the next one.
Yeah.